Economics is not an exact science. There's no magic formula to tell you whether something is good or bad for the economy. Were Trump and Biden's economic policies more impactful than COVID? Virtually every economist will tell you that COVID was more impactful. Similarly, presidents inherit their economies. The first few years of their term are typically determined by the policy of their predecessors. So often these things come down to your opinion or what your philosophy on economics is. And in this part of the series, we're going to talk about one of those things, which is corporate tax rates. The policies of the two candidates are pretty easy to understand. Trump, in his first term back in 2017, lowered the corporate tax rate from where it was for a very long time, 35%, down to 21%. And in his next term, he wants to lower it again to 15% for companies that manufacture in America. Harris wants to raise the corporate tax rate to 28%. In this video, we're going to talk about three specific things. What impact does changing the corporate tax rate have on economic growth? How we incentivize American manufacturing through the tax code, and who benefits from higher or lower corporate taxes. Let's start with economic growth. The argument has always been that if you lower corporate tax rate, that business will do better and more people will invest in business. And because of that, the economy will grow at a faster rate and everyone will do better because the economy is growing faster. We're going to look at the simplest of data to look at this, which is what the top corporate tax rate was going back to 1950, kind of modern society, post-World War II, and compare that to GDP, gross domestic product growth rate over that same time period. So here is federal corporate tax rate. Now this is the top tax rate. There are brackets below this, but if you look at those brackets, you'll see that any sizable business is always typically going to be paying the largest tax rate. So back to 1950, end of World War II, we're seeing corporate tax rates in the low 50s, high 40s until the mid 80s. Ronald Reagan's the president. We kind of Reaganomics during this time. We see a dramatic lowering of the corporate tax rate down to 34, 35 for another really long time period. And then this is that 2017 corporate tax break from 35% down to 21%. So from 1950 to now, we have steadily lowered the corporate tax rate over this time. And if we look at gross domestic product rate, now this line is 10%, the big dark line is 0. We can see that from 1950 until now, gross domestic product hasn't really changed that much, the growth rate of it. Right now, you're kind of in the mid to low single digits. This, of course, is COVID, so we didn't have a stellar year here. This was just the year before it was COVID, and thus everybody woke up and started buying things again. It's kind of come back down to reality. This is only 2023. We have a lot more data on this. GDP is kind of back in this rate here. So, actually the highest GDP growth rate was actually the time period where corporate taxes were the highest, which is kind of in this time period. But again, there's a lot of competing effects, right? We can't just say that the only impact on GDP over this time is the fact that we lowered corporate tax rates. So, but this graph here tells me the story of we made some dramatic changes to corporate tax rates over the last 70 years, and we really haven't seen a whole lot of impact on how fast the economy grows. Okay, let's talk about American manufacturing. To understand this, we have to go back to the 2017 tax cuts. When Trump lowered it from 35% to 21%, there was an incentive back in the 35% days for American manufacturing. If you produced in America at that time, your corporate tax rate was closer to like 31%. And when he dropped it to 21%, he got rid of that policy and he did what in his mind was good for American manufacturing in other ways. Tariffs, redrafting things like NAFTA, the trade war with China, all sorts of stuff. And that policy was heavily criticized, that bonus for American manufacturing, because like most tax policies, companies were gaming the system. So let's imagine that you're a walkie-talkie manufacturer. No one builds a walkie-talkie from raw materials all within their own country. So if you're an American manufacturer, you're buying the components from all over the world, and then you're building the walkie-talkie in your factory and then packaging and shipping it out. And I think everyone would agree that is American manufacturing. But what if you're making Easter baskets and now you're buying individually wrapped candies from all over the world? You're just putting them in the Easter basket, wrapping it in the big cellophane package, and shipping that off for selling. Is that American manufacturing? You can see that's a little different than the walkie-talkie example. And then what if you're a walkie-talkie producer and all you're doing, you buy the walkie-talkie from China and you just put it in the box. All you're doing is packaging in America. I think most people would assume that that's kind of not American manufacturing. But the point here is you see that this is a gradient, right? And where do you draw the line that counts as American manufacturing, especially amongst all these different industries that are so radically different between electronics manufacturing and candy manufacturing? How do you fairly draw the line? And as soon as you do draw the line, every company knows exactly what they have to do, the bare minimum to count as an American manufacturer, and they will move to that line. If you said, well, the final product has to be in some way assembled in America, the walkie-talkie, right? No one cares about the packaging, so putting the walkie-talkie in the packaging is not value added, that's not American manufacturing. You have to build the walkie-talkie here. Well, what if I buy the walkie-talkie from China and the battery from Thailand, and all I do is put the battery in, then put it in the box? Now I'm an American manufacturer again, right? You can see how these policies are going to be gamed by the system. So now Trump wants to reinstitute one of these policies for lowering taxes for American manufacturing. And you can see this kind of comes down to your opinion, your economic philosophy. If you want to know my opinion real quick, I think there is value in providing a tax policy that incentivizes American manufacturing, so long as we understand that that policy is almost certainly going to be gamed by virtually every company that can. Right? So we just have to understand that no tax policy is going to be even remotely close to perfect, and they're going to be gamed. Which kind of brings me into my next topic, which is who actually benefits from high and low corporate tax rates. I think it's easiest to understand that the people that will benefit the most from it are the people who are receiving the profits of the business, right? If you tax the profits more or less, they're going to receive more or less money. That's investors and owners. Of course, the classic argument has been that the economy will grow so much better when business is doing well that everyone will benefit from that. But we saw that the economy in terms of GDP growth really has not changed really at all over the last 70 years when corporate tax rates have changed dramatically. But what about the investor side of that? That's the stock market, which isn't always necessarily related to the growth of the economy. So let's look at stock market returns. That's this. Here's 1950 when we really started talking about corporate tax rates. And then here's kind of Reaganomics in the middle 80s when those tax rates started to come down dramatically. And so we can look at has recent stock market performance been better than, let's say 1950 to kind of the mid 80s. Now there are of course other determining factors on how the stock market is doing. This is just one of these factors, but we could make the argument that there's a few less red lines. Maybe these green lines are a little bit higher than through this time. And I would say in general, we have seen better stock market performance lately with lower corporate tax rates. So I think there is an argument there to be made that investors and the stock market in general, and thus everyone who's able to invest in the stock market, has seen better performance, with lower corporate tax rates recently, and thus any change to it would probably impact the stock market's performance. All right, the other big impact when we're talking about lowering or raising corporate tax rates is on the government, right, and their revenue. So this is a graph of federal revenue by type over 100%, right? So back in 1953, we see that individual income taxes was about, 42, 43%. Corporate income tax was almost 30% of all federal tax revenue. And then we have Social Security, which I'll talk about in a minute. Excise tax, this is the tariffs and other taxes on specific goods. And then more recently, right, here's Reaganomics, where we see corporate income tax really draw down. And then here we are recently, where corporate tax revenue is almost less than 10% of total tax revenue, right? So we have certainly not seen a situation where by lowering corporate tax rates, business does so well that their profits grow so much that we bring in even more tax revenue than we would have with higher tax rates. That's certainly not the case. And when we reduce a tax revenue source, There's only two options. You grow the deficit, the federal deficit, what we owe, gets bigger, or you bring in tax revenue from another source. Now, Trump has talked about increasing tariffs, increasing this red part, which we're going to talk about when we get to tariffs. And I bet no matter what your initial opinion is on tariffs, you will be surprised by that video. So stick around. But this is going to have a dramatic impact on the deficit, which is going to be the last part of this series in terms of, kind of where we're headed, because neither candidate is running on a platform of balancing the budget or reducing the deficit or anything along those lines. Trump is talking about efficiency improvements, which again, we will talk about when we get to the budget section. Because corporate tax rates have such little impact on economic growth, I really think this comes down to your own opinions and kind of economic philosophy on who should be paying taxes and things like the stock market and the federal deficit. So pick the candidate that most closely aligns with your philosophy on those things. If you want to continue watching this series about the two candidates' tax policies, then here's the next video. Stick around the channel for similar content, and I will talk to you soon.